All right, so we've gone through a discussion about life. We could spend an entire time on life. We've wrapped up our discussion on death and kind of looking at that as a kind of, I don't want to say just as a definition, but like kind of an overview. What do we mean by death? How does God view death? How should we view death? If you were to give me one word for how we should view death, what would that be for you? Inevitable. Is it though? Okay, that's a couple words, yeah. How does God view death? Let's start with that. He hates it. He hates it. Um, how does he refer to death? An enemy. Yeah, and the final enemy to be defeated, as a matter of fact. So death is not part of God's plan, and that's part of the reason why we talked about life at the beginning. It's like, what's God's intention in creating? What's the purpose of life? Why does God create and invite us into the life that he has been living? And we talked a little bit about how, really the purpose, the ultimate meaning in life is to know God, to experience him, and to serve his purposes. And, and you think back to like even his planting of Adam and Eve in this garden, there was good work to be done there. They were distinct from the rest of creation. But we see that death enters the picture. And so we began a little bit of a discussion last week on this, what we call the intermediate state. And really what we mean by that is kind of in between the time that Christ returns and the times that maybe whether our bodies or the bodies of people we love, when they give out, what happens to us? There are two individuals in the scriptures that escaped death. Can anybody name them for me? Elijah's one of them. He's caught up in this chariot of fire. Do you guys remember the other person? Enoch, yeah. Enoch walked with God, and God took him on home. So back to Shane's point, one of the things that, part of the reason why this topic is so good is because unless the Lord returns, we have a 100% chance of death, okay? What's happened because of sin, what's happened because of the fact that our bodies give out, that we will not maintain this type of existence forever. But does that mean we will die? No. Especially if we want to take Jesus at his word. If Jesus says, if anyone believes in me, he will never die. If anyone lives and believes in me, he will never die. And so I like taking Jesus' word seriously, especially because what validates that is the fact that he himself defeated death by dying. And that whole vindication moment, there's this victory over death, but there's also a vindication that takes place where everything that Jesus taught is now solidified, because if God raises him from the dead, if he's teaching all of this stuff and he just dies a good teacher, is he to be believed? No, because part of what he even predicted was that he was going to die and rise again. And so if Jesus doesn't rise from the dead as good as his teachings are, he's either insane or he's a liar, okay? He definitely would not be a good Messiah to follow if he claimed one thing and then it doesn't happen, because God is not validating his messiahship. So we come to this topic of intermediate state about what happens to us if our physical bodies stop living in a bios sense, but what happens to us personally in a zoe sense. Do you guys remember those two terms for life? Bios would just be kind of like the physical, living, like trees live. They have a biology to them. But zoe is the Greek word that we have for eternal life, okay? So intermediate state. We talked a little bit about the different views. There are five views on this, and they fall into two primary categories. We talked about the unconscious state, which is interesting because it's kind of like saying there really isn't an intermediary state. Like if you're not conscious of it, are you experiencing it? Maybe an outside observer could say yes, but you are not really aware of it. And we started off with the first of our unconscious views, which, does anybody remember what that was? Did anybody fill in the position? Recreation. And what that was really talking about was this idea that, does anybody need a sheet to fill in? Do you need one? Can somebody grab, Regina, would you mind grabbing a Okay. You got a couple? We'll get Michelle one. You want a pen, Michelle? I've got one here. That's okay. I usually, you can write on the back of that if you want to. Recreation, if you guys remember this view states that substance dualism is false. What do we mean by substance dualism? Meaning that an individual is made up of both a physical body and a soul or spirit. Now, there's some discussion about soul, body, and spirit. Is a human a trichotomy or a dichotomy? That's another discussion. But for our purposes, we will just say that, if we're thinking about it, there's a spiritual side and there's a physical side. And God creates both, okay? What it means to be human is to have both of those things, okay? But in the recreation position would say that there isn't substance dualism. Humans don't have a soul that's a substance. Rather, when they die, they just kind of become extinct, and when the resurrection happens, God recreates the person, not from pre-existing material, but from brand new stuff. Do you remember us talking about that last week? Which is kind of like, is this like a clone thing that happens? Like there really isn't this intermediary state. We just vanish out of this existence, and God pops a physical body into existence that is supposed to be connected to us. Now, some of the responses to this, if you think back to the passages that we read in 2 Corinthians as well as in Philippians, those are kind of pretty big things that you have to wrestle with from a Christian perspective. But we do see that within the Christian worldview that substance dualism is evident. We have a soul and we have a physical body. And there's also no way to account for the identity of a person throughout the changes of the body, since a person who has died has no connection to this recreated person. The individual that exists in heaven is not literally the same person. You get into all this kind of weird ways of thinking about things. And I think if you remember, I said, as a Christian, we're promised eternal life, not a look-alike. Somebody that looks a lot like us is experiencing that. Is that us? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. The biggest thing is just it's incompatible with the scriptures that we talked about before. Can you guys think of any other scriptures that might kind of, the ones that we talked about was where Paul talks about presently we are clothed in a dwelling or a house that is that's being corrupted, but then we will be clothed again, and there's this period of nakedness in between, like we don't want to be unclothed, we want to be clothed. And then the Philippians passage talks about the idea of like it's better like to be with Christ. I consider that to be far better, but then also if I remain, that means laborious work or good work that I'll get to do on his behalf.
Is that kind of similar to when Jesus talked about Lazarus, where there was a chasm between them?
Yes, this is a perfect place to look at, and we'll get to. We're going to use that scripture tonight. Yeah, there's the passage where Jesus uses a kind of a parable of sorts about the poor man. The rich man, I should say, and Lazarus. Lazarus is the poor man, and we're going to talk about that. But he uses this kind of parable that speaks about the way that people would be thinking about what happens to you when you die. And there's a few other passages about that. But when you look at Scripture, another big one is to the criminal that's dying on the cross next to Jesus. He basically stands up for Jesus and says, hey, we deserve the punishment that we've been given. This man's done nothing wrong. And then he says, remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom. That's an odd thing to say about somebody who's getting ready to die.
And he said paradise.
Well, this is what, and Jesus' response to that is, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, that's a very short sentence, but there's a lot to unpack there. For Jesus to make this promise to this individual, he's talking not only about a place, but a recognition of who he is with and where he is, okay? And he's also talking about a time, okay? You've got a lot that's being talked about here that there's going to be a recognition of today, you're going to be with me in a place referred to as paradise. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through. These unconscious views, you have to sidestep a lot of scripture to justify, okay? So let's go to view B. This is a fun word to say. Starts with a P. Perspectival. It's almost like, Todd, are you making up words? Perspective. Just write down perspective. the perspective position. Now, what this view means is that one's perspective on earth is shaped by the confines of our limited understanding. In other words, we perceive time and we perceive what it means to kind of like live life. But when a person dies, they enter into this new realm that appears from our perspective now to be like happening in this moment that's bound by time, but there's this kind of an idea of like this waiting period, but it's only from our perspective. But for the person that crosses into this existence, it's really this instantaneous arrival into God's time. Okay, this is one of these like brain stretchers. So we view time kind of like in this big long timeline, and like we jump out of this line into an existence with God that is not bound by time. And so our perception right now is that there's this period of waiting, but really when we get to this place, it's going to be like everybody showing up at the same time. You know, because if you were to take the big long timeline of God that goes infinite in both directions, how much space on that line is the entire existence of this life and this existence? We're going to get there, okay? Now, philosophically, it's one of those things that is kind of interesting to think about. Like, okay, if we're entering into the realm where God is, does that mean that we are in his same existence of time? Or and so the whole point of this view is to say there really isn't this intermediary state. We step into a timeless existence, and it's the same point that everybody else steps into this timeless existence, and it's as if, you know, there's really no waiting period at all. Okay?
Well, that sounds familiar because I read a book about Einstein saying God doesn't throw dice.
Okay? God doesn't throw.
Yeah, and he was talking about time, and
Yeah.
the electron orbits the atom, and he couldn't figure out what instantaneous place it was going to be. It drove him nuts.
Yeah, and this is where when you start to get into like theorizing about like time and how we view time and how does God, if he exists outside of time, what does it mean to enter into his space? And the good thing is there's some answers to this. But the whole point of this is that we are kind of like erroneously viewing the dead from our time-bound perspective. Like somebody who passes into God's space, like to them it's in an instant, you know, it's a blinking of an eye. But from our perspective, it's like, oh, it's been however many years since this loved one that we had passed away, okay? Now, there are some responses to this. There's no good reason to believe that time is bound only to our universe. God is an infinitely conscious being. He's outside of time because he's timeless. But here's the thing that we have to remember. Something is temporal if two questions can be asked about it. When was it, and how long was it? The first is a matter of location. The second is a matter of duration, all right? Now, this is a big statement that basically says God as a timeless entity doesn't mean that he's bound, or that if we enter into his existence that somehow time goes away, okay? Time as we understand it can still exist, and I think we talked a little bit about this last week, where if I want to go and be with somebody, like I'm not instantly there. You know, if I want to walk over to Josh, you know, there's a duration of time, you know, not just when it's happening, but how long it takes for me to get there, okay? And so there's no reason to believe that somehow time just floats away. We aren't bound by some sort of limit to time, but time is still something that we use for measurement. Does that make sense? So those in the afterlife, including the ultimate glorified new heaven and new earth, will still be able to talk, ponder things, change what we're thinking, all those sorts of things. And all of those activities require time, right? Things don't just happen on an instant. Yeah, Joe's got a question.
So what makes sense to me is we're supposed to inherit the earth again, and it's supposed to be
Mhm.
renewed
Yes,
and have lives.
yes.
And so isn't time necessary?
Yeah, and this is part of the argument, is that just because we enter into the realm where God is doesn't mean that time as a component for understanding or determining things or movement, all of those things are going to still be necessary. And that's the problem really with this perspective is that like it it doesn't take into consideration the fact that, for one thing, one of the letters that Peter writes, where he says, God is not slow as some people think that someone is slow. You know, God's patient. You know, like we when people say things like, well, how come God hasn't returned yet? Well, you know, time from God's perspective isn't necessarily like, you know, it can be different from ours, but the reason that there is patience that God, like if God exudes patience, there is a relationship to time that he has, even though he may be timeless. Does that make sense? So we're going to get to the discussion about heaven and earth and the renewed new heavens, new earth, and all of that sort of stuff. And that's where if you postulate this idea of entering into God's time, that like time doesn't exist anymore, well, on a theoretical level, we can say that statement, but the reality is we still are involved in conscious things that we are aware of. You know, I was thinking about this, and then I started thinking about that. Time's involved, even if we're not bound by time. Does that make sense? Okay. These are part of the reason why some of these views are attractive to people, is because they're kind of like big, you know, they're speculative, they're philosophically based. I mean, when we're talking about, you know, what is time? How does time exist? How does God exist within time? Another thing to consider of a response to this is that even if the scientific model of space-time relativity is granted, it does not follow that disembodied souls are timeless. It only follows that they enter into a different mode of time, okay? The mode of time might be different. It's not going to be bound and limited like the existence that we're experiencing now, but it doesn't mean that it just goes away, that everything happens instantaneously, okay? And it's also incompatible with the scriptures that support a conscious intermediate state. There's a passage in the Old Testament where somebody comes back that shouldn't come back. Do you guys know that story at all? King Saul has expelled all of the witches, the mediums, the people that consult the dead. Typically speaking, they're probably consulting demons more than they're consulting people who've actually passed. He goes to this witch, the witch of Endor, which not Endor as in Star Wars, but Endor as in a place in the Old Testament, okay? And what's interesting is Saul, who goes to this woman, he wants her to conjure up the spirit of Samuel, because he's trying to get advice from Samuel. Okay, the prophet Samuel has died. And what you would typically do if you were going to be this type of a person is you would dig a pit, which was supposed to be like, I'm digging down into the place where the underworld is, and we're going to talk about these places here in a little bit. And then you would have some sort of means by which of conjuring, whether that might be through some pharmaceutical way or through some sort of chanting, whatever, but this spirit, this being is supposed to return and give you advice, okay? There's even some of that people believe even happens today. They're tampering with things which are not of God, and part of the reason why God says, don't do this, is because you're shaking hands with people that God doesn't want you to shake hands with, because they're not really people. But anyhow, what's interesting is this woman does this after she even says to Saul, like, hey, King Saul, because Saul's disguised himself. It's like, the king has expelled all of the mediums. What are you talking about? I can't do that. And he convinces her, okay? And Samuel actually shows up. And it freaks this woman out, which tells you one of two things. Either she's been kind of a charlatan this whole time, and like when this real thing happens, it's like, whoa, I didn't know what I was messing with. Or, you know, this is the real deal, and what she's been seeing has been kind of false entities or deceptive spirits. But the thing that happens is that Samuel does come and he basically confronts Saul and he's like, you shouldn't be doing this. Now, I'm bringing all this up to be like, here is a disembodied spirit. He's not flesh and bones. He shows up. He is who he is. Saul recognizes him, and he is kind of chastised by Samuel for doing this, okay? And I say all of this to be like, here is an individual who is existing within some sort of space-time realm that comes back, that God allows this to happen to. And so some of this idea of like this instantaneous stuff, this removal of time altogether, it doesn't bode well. All right. Letter C, number C. I used to have a professor that would always say that. Number C. This is the soul sleep position. Soul sleep position. Nobody's a Soul Train fan, huh? Okay. Thank you. My wife laughs at my jokes. All right, this is the view that there's a time interval between death and resurrection. The person exists, but they exist in this state of sleep, okay? If we understand, like when you go to sleep at night, let's say you don't have any dreams, and you wake up, were you conscious during that time? Depends on how you're viewing conscious, you know. You are, or let's think about it this way. If you are put under anesthesia, okay, you count backward and all of a sudden you're waking up in the recovery room. Like you don't have a conscious recollection of what took place in this period of time from the moment the lights went out to the moment the lights came back up, okay? So the soul sleep basically says, well, this is kind of what happens when you die. Your body dies, but your soul just kind of goes to sleep into this unconscious state where your soul still exists, but it really doesn't wake up until it's reunited with your resurrected body and you have this soul and body come back together again, okay? Now, where do you think this idea might come from? Okay, so there is the sense of the resurrection that those who have died in Christ will be raised. There's a word in particular that Paul and even Jesus uses when they are referring to somebody who has died. Yeah, asleep. Go to 1 Thessalonians 4. This is another passage, and we're going to look at this again. We might skip over it since we're looking at it now, but 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul is writing to a church that is very, 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 very concerned because they are expecting Jesus to return like any moment. Like they are so prepared, like today could be the day. Are you ready? Well, in the meantime, some of these followers of Jesus are dying. Their bodies are giving out. And they're like, whoa, they're not experiencing Jesus' return and the resurrection. What's going to happen to them? Okay, and Paul's going to address that. So right around verse 13, Paul says, now we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who are asleep. This is part of the reason why we talk about the intermediate state. Okay, why we bring this into this whole context of life, death, and everything after. Paul says, I don't want you guys to be uninformed about this. I don't want you to be uninformed about what happens to you when your body gives out, okay? But he uses this word as a euphemism, asleep. Does that mean they are literally asleep? Sleep and death. Yeah, and that's usually added because when translators take words in the Greek that mean one thing, but we know that the author's intending something else, sometimes translations will add words to like not confuse the reader. Like somebody's going to read this and go, oh, he's talking about literal sleep. No, it's sleep death, okay? Jesus does this when he raises Jairus' daughter. You guys remember this story? Jesus comes, Jairus comes to him. He says, my 12-year-old daughter, she's about to die. Please come and heal her. On the way, there's this woman with a hemorrhage who like interrupts this procession, and Jesus heals her. And it's kind of like, hey, we got a place to go. Come on, she's dying. And by the time they get back home, the girl has died, and they've met Jairus and Jesus and everybody out, and there's like, hey, your daughter's died. Don't trouble the master anymore. And Jesus says, don't give up hope, just believe. And he takes Peter, James, and John with him, and they go inside, and there's all of these mourners, and there are these professional. They're weeping and wailing, and just and Jesus says, why are you guys weeping? She's only asleep. And they start making fun of Jesus. They start laughing at him. Like they aren't unintelligent people. Just because they lived back in the first century, they knew what a dead body looked like. They knew what happened to somebody when the body died, okay? So why would Jesus say she's asleep? Now, the people that would hold to like soul sleep, they try to attach this like, well, this is kind of what Jesus is talking about. The soul has gone to sleep. She's unconscious. Or the people that Paul is talking about, when he uses the euphemism for sleep, that they're actually sleeping in the grave. Paul goes on in this passage in First Thessalonians 4, and he actually uses this word sleep a total of 3 times. So it's one of these, it's like a common euphemism that he's using. Now, why would he use that? If you go the literal route and be like, oh, Paul means literally asleep, like in a soul sleep sort of thing, there's a big problem because Paul says things like, it's better for me to go and to be with the Lord. Why would it be better for you to go and how would you be with the Lord if your soul is unconscious somewhere waiting to be woken up? When Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise, is Jesus misinformed about what happens when you die? Of all the people who aren't misinformed, it would be Jesus, okay? So, what's the problem with soul sleep? Typically, this is held by some of the same groups that hold to this recreation version where like, oh, you just kind of like stop existing and then a new you pops into existence. Well, when there's trouble with that, because it's like, that sounds like you're making a clone of me, but not really me, then you come to step 2, which is like, well, what we mean by that is like your soul goes to sleep. Like it's unconscious. And they'll use different passages, even from like Psalms and different places like that, to try to justify this idea that when they use the word sleep, it's a literal soul sleep. In these instances, the soul is merely seen as this kind of like life spark or a life force. The soul isn't really tied to personhood, if that makes any sense. It's not really who you are. It's just kind of this spark that's kind of gotten dim and has kind of gone out and sleeps, okay? So there are several passages, like I said, in the Bible that refer to death as sleep that they use to support this. Positive perspective in that it doesn't do away with the soul aspect, and it shows that humans hold both a body and a soul in their possession. But the biggest problem with this is the way that Jesus talks about what happens to people after they die, which appears to be a conscious existence with him in a place that is recognizable to be just as Jesus described it, okay? So these are the 3 kind of perspectives within the unconscious view, not biblical, even though they try to lump some biblical connected things to it. Not really an intermediate state at all because you're not even conscious of it. If anything, it's kind of like this fake thing that we use in describing death now, but we either instantaneously arrive at the end or we don't have a soul that exists, but when the resurrection happens, we get a new body, or the soul that we think we have actually kind of goes to sleep and we're unconscious, and then at the resurrection, we all wake back up again, okay? None of those are biblical. All right. Now, there's part of you might be like, Todd, why are we talking about this? Well, we use different phrases all the time, and if it gets confusing to people, especially like sleep, if there's a group that, oh, I know what that means, that's soul sleep. I've met people who claim to be Bible-believing Christians that like they would hold to soul sleep as like, yeah, that's what happens. Like you're not consciously aware of anything. Okay. Well, why does Jesus use examples that he does of conscious existence in the midst of an intermediate state if it doesn't really exist that way? Why does he make a promise to somebody who is dying that they will be somewhere, not alone, but experiencing bliss, but like being with him, where they would also recognize him? If you recognize something, you're experiencing time, you're experiencing conscious awareness, you know where you are, you know who other people are, and you kind of got an understanding of your surroundings in a conscious way, okay? It's not a dreamlike state, okay? So that kind of wraps up the, wait, there's some more here. I've got some more in my notes. Hooray! Let's talk about this. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 10. Somebody want to read that? These are more objections to the soul sleep. Yep. Okay. This verse makes sense only if we are experiencing and understanding that we are with him. Okay. that kind of conscious awareness sort of a thing. Whether we live on earth or die, if sleeping means that we are unconscious, how can this verse make any sense? Sleep is also an act of the body. Does the soul need sleep? Well, if it does, it only needs it because it's connected to a body that needs sleep. There's no clear reason to think that a disembodied soul would need sleep and rest. Another thing is that the existence of angels shows that spirits or spiritual beings can and do live conscious, disembodied lives. So what's the problem with this in regards to humans? That's another problem here. And also these references to Sheol. Have you guys ever heard that word before? Sheol, S-H-E-O-L, Sheol, or the grave. Sometimes your Bible may translate it as like Hades or underworld. Reference to Sheol in the aspect of a seeming unconsciousness, they're directed more at a judgment of God in relation to sin and an inability to exist in relationship like what is experienced here on earth. In other words, to talk about a place that you have no conscious awareness of seems silly. Okay, why talk about a place that you would go to that's described in this kind of not good place if you're not consciously aware of it? Often when we think about the word Sheol or Hades, it has a connection to a type of judgment that is taking place prior to a final judgment, okay? This might be a good spot to maybe use the board. How does that sound? Let's switch it up a little bit, all right? We talked about life. We're going to put life over here. Oh, this is a terrible pen. Can you read that at all? Okay, can you read that? Okay. So we're going to make a box like this. We're going to do this with it. And we're going to take that down like that. My drawing skills are not very good, all right? So we're going to have kind of life over here. We'll make death here. I'm going to do INT for intermediate state. And then we're going to do, we'll do final resurrection. Does resurrection have 2 S's or just 2 R's? I'm a terrible speller. Actually, 3 R's, but that's okay. Because it starts with R, right? Ha! Wake up, Sherry. Okay, I'm teasing. All right. So we talked about life, okay? Now, we did mention that death, what types of death did we talk about? Well, we talked about kind of like physical death, like when your body gives out, but we talked about a spiritual death. What is spiritual death? It's a separation, and it's one of those things that actually, and it's different from eternal death. So there's physical death, spiritual death. Actually, let's do it in this right order. Well, there's spiritual death, physical death, eternal death. What's spiritual death in relation to somebody that's body is actually living? Yeah, sin. And the idea of like there's separation. So even while we're living, there's kind of we talked about the Romans 1 passage about God handing us over. So there's an existence that even while I'm living, there's kind of a death of sorts down here and a life up here, okay? When physical death happens, all right, there is kind of like a dual existence, all right? This is terrible, terrible, terrible graph writing, all right? We've already talked about what's one of the possibilities that somebody can enter into biblically. Jesus on the cross, paradise, okay? Paradise, okay? And then what's also referred to from time to time, and we'll put this down here as Sheol, okay? Now, Sheol, this is where it gets kind of confusing because Sheol can mean like just going to the grave. It doesn't necessarily have a judgment aspect to it. It's just like they died. Like if you think about there's Old Testament passages that talk about Sheol, and it's not necessarily in like this terrible judgment existence. It's just talking about the grave. But there are times where it's referred to as kind of a place of judgment, if you will, all right? You see in the New Testament more the idea of paradise. There's another phrase that's used in Jesus' day, and this is what we find in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Go to Luke chapter 16. Here comes the tacos. Luke 16, around verse 19. Now, Jesus is going to use this parable, and it might even be a parable that is similar, that like has a framework that people would be aware of. It's not necessarily meaning like he's showing us a glimpse of what it's going to be like when we die, but he's also kind of showing us a glimpse of what it's going to be like when we die. All right. The point of this parable is not, guys, let me tell you about this intermediate state that you're going to have questions about. It's more about making sure that you are focused on the things in this life that matter, so that when you get to the next life, you know, you are experiencing connection to God. Because it talks about this in regards to the life that the rich man thought he was living, but he was actually here. And the person of Lazarus, who looks like somebody would consider to be like death, was actually like life. And when they both die, they enter into different existences, okay? So let's read this together. I'll read it out loud. It says, there was a rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. This is a guy that would be like, this guy must be blessed by God, right? Like in the world's perspective, like, oh, this guy, he's to have purple clothing, whoo, that was some fine living, all right? Didn't have any, not only did he eat, he got to eat every day, he ate sumptuously, all right? But at his gate, somebody who was outside of his house, lay a poor man named Lazarus, whose body was covered with sores. Lazarus isn't just poor and he can't, fend for himself. He's also diseased. He looks, which one of these guys looks like life and which one looks like death? Okay? This is the point that Jesus is making. The rich man in people's eyes, like, oh, this guy's, he's living the good life, right? And this poor dude that's outside, he's got dogs licking his sores. You want to talk about cultural implications there. Ugh, this guy. But Jesus is going to flip the tables here in just a second, all right? He often flipped tables. This poor man named Lazarus, who longed to eat what fell from the rich man's tables. In addition, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. This is another name for paradise. Your version might also say Abraham's bosom. It was just a way of where do the faithful ones of Israel end up? If Father Abraham is the one who is loved by God, vindicated by God, that there's this idea of being connected to. Can anybody read what I wrote there? I can't even read what I wrote there. Abraham's bosom or Abraham's side. The image that's there is kind of like resting, being consoled, being comforted. Being rejuvenated by Abraham, okay? And it goes on and says, the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, it's another name for Sheol. Hades is often used more in like the Greco-Roman world as kind of like this underworld, like it's a spiritual realm, but it's kind of like the bad place. You don't want to go there, all right? And in Hades, as he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far off with Lazarus at his side. So what are the things that we understand just so far? Well, I don't see it in the Bible either, but that's another topic. But this is, did you guys hear he said, I don't see purgatory? Yes. Debbie's got a question. What's your question? Mm-hmm. Both die. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and right. Exactly. And that This is how this is all going to line up. This is why we have to talk about the intermediate state before we talk about the second coming and when we talk about resurrection. Because a lot of times what happens when we think about like, well, what happens when we die? You either go to heaven or you go to hell. Kinda. But the reality, what's happening here, and as we see this unfolded in this parable, and again, Jesus isn't giving this parable to teach us what these states are like, but in the midst of this parable, he's teaching us what these states are like, okay? The intent isn't to set up this chart, but we get kind of a bird's eye view of what takes place as he's using this to tell them a different story, okay? So there is a sense that, and this is even in the book of Hebrews, we're going to look at this later, but the book of Hebrews talks about, it's basically the fate of every individual, to die and then face judgment. Like it's this idea of you die and immediately you face judgment. Now, what type of judgment? There's kind of a final judgment, but then there's also kind of like this intermediary state judgment that takes place. Yeah, that's where this would be the chasm. It doesn't seem like it's very far apart, but this would be kind of like the dividing place that we're gonna read about here in the story, okay? Because what we see is, even in this, there's a sense of torment, okay? What is that torment? Is that torment, it could just be the fact that I'm separated from God, okay? I'm not experiencing even the type of relationship that was available to me with God here. Now I'm separated from that. We're going to see that the way that his torment is described is one of like he's thirsty. There's pain that's involved here. All right, let's keep reading, and this will unfold. So he looked up, and he saw Abraham far off with Lazarus. So this guy is looking up, and he's seeing, and that might also be part of the torment too. Like, I see what I'm missing out on. All right. So he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus." Send the poor guy that used to sit outside of my gate that I really paid no attention to and I didn't feed, I didn't do anything about. Send him to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue because I am in anguish in this fire. Ooh, something new has entered the picture. Okay, a description of fire. Okay, now some of this is dealing with the thoughts of what would be present in Jesus' day, okay? Hell is often described as a place of separation. It can be described as a place of darkness. Jesus calls it a place of outer darkness. It's also described as, like, he uses the word Gehenna. Gehenna is a place that the Israelites would take their garbage and their refuse, and it would, if you've ever been, you guys ever been to a dump, like the Rumpke dump, okay? Smells. There's a lot of flies, a lot of rodents, fires. They burn fires a lot there because of the gas and stuff that kind of, as things are decomposing, and the methane that gets produced. And so it's a despicable place. It's a trash heap. It's a dung heap. It's referred to sometimes. So all of these words that are used to describe the place that you don't want to be, well, first and foremost, it's because you're separated from God. Okay. But there are other elements that kind of come into this idea of judgment. Gehenna was also kind of this place where the judgment of God had happened earlier on in Israel's history. So there's a lot of baggage with these terms, okay? But regardless of how we're looking at this place, what's one thing that you take away from this? It's bad. Thank you. Sometimes this is simple flannel graph type stuff, right? This is bad. This isn't where you want to be. There's torment that's here. There's thirst. There's fire. There's all of the bad stuff. And this guy is crying out and saying, "Father Abraham, please, I'm not even asking you to do this, but that one that is clutching to the paradise that is connected to you, please send him. Just dip, like, I will have some relief if there's just a tiny drop of water on my tongue." Okay? Verse 25. But Abraham said, Child, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things and Lazarus likewise bad things? What's happening here? Bad things, good things. What's happening here? Bad things, good things. There's a reversal that's taking place here. And so what Abraham's saying to this rich man who is really he's now being tormented, he says, remember you received your good things and Lazarus likewise bad things, but now he is comforted here and you are in anguish. Besides all of this, a great chasm has been fixed between us. It's a fixed, there's no bridge that's there. So that those who want to cross over from here to you cannot do so. In other words, even if I could send Lazarus, I can't. There's a judgment of sorts. There's a fixed chasm placed there by God. And he goes on and says, they can't cross over from here to you. They cannot do so. And no one can cross from there to us. So the rich man said, then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house. Who does he want to be sent to his house, to his father's house? Yeah. He's experienced this blessed paradise. Send him back. He's consciously aware that this guy exists. Send him back to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers to warn them so that they don't come into this place of torment. Okay? Send him back. Give them a warning. Like, I can't escape this. Please, somebody warn my family. Here's what Abraham has to say. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. They must respond to them. Then the rich man said, no, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He replied to him, if they did not respond to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. Okay? Now, what's the point of this parable? What's Jesus trying to tell the crowds he's telling this parable to? Yeah, the reality is we have what we need to turn to God and to do what God is calling us to do. And even Abraham here is going like, they've got Moses and the prophets. Now, Jesus is telling this story, not because he's hanging all of this on Moses and the prophets, but Jesus will also go on to say, they've spoken about me. Think about when Jesus is raised from the dead and he's meeting with the men on the disciples on the road to Emmaus. They weren't necessarily both men, but anyhow, they're walking on the road to Emmaus, and he says, didn't the scripture say that this must happen to the Messiah? And he says he takes them through the law and the prophets, and they go through to see how the Messiah must suffer and die. Okay? In other words, what's Jesus getting at here? And he's kind of doing this foreshadowing that even if someone rises from the dead, there are going to be people who don't believe. They're still going to think they have this when they actually have this. But the end result is this and not this, okay? Now, the final resurrection, when we think about coming out of the intermediate state, you would end up having kind of like second coming, which we will get to. Beautiful handwriting. And then there's going to be kind of like this new heaven, new earth, hell, final judgment, okay? Notice, whether it is spiritual death, physical death, or eternal death, all of those are enemies of God. He wants none of this. Life, being with him, experiencing new heaven and new earth, okay? This is why it's somewhat important to talk about like this, because when Paul says, I don't want you guys to be uninformed about what happens to you when you die, that those who have passed from this life into the next, if we go back to that 1 Thessalonians 4 passage, he says, they will be raised first. The ones who are experiencing this, they're going to be raised first to new life. And they will be with Jesus when this great coming together moment happens and we return to watch the final judgment take place, okay? We're going to get to this part in a little bit, all right? But let's talk real quickly. I think we can do this if we can wrap this up. There's 2 conscious views of death. I think this is the back page. I don't know why this is indented. The Platonic view. Platonic, like Plato. The reason why this is called a Platonic view is that there's this idea of substance dualism. There's a body and a spirit, or a body and a soul. But in a Platonic view, there is no resurrection of the body. There's none of this stuff. Okay? This is where it ends. You go to heaven. You're a disembodied spirit. The point of death is to escape the evil material that is of this world and that your flesh is a part of. Okay, this would be how many people within the Greco-Roman world would understand. Like, if you've heard the stories about like crossing the river Styx and that sort of stuff. The idea is that like the flesh is really what's kind of confining you. The flesh is corrupt. It's not good. That when you die, you escape this corruption and you enter into a more ethereal, wonderful spiritual place. But there is even still some discussion about what that looks like. And you can understand this a little bit within kind of the Greco-Roman literature. If you think about, different writings from history that kind of describe people going into the underworld and kind of the judgment that takes place there. There's a real person that exists, and that real person is the soul. The body just doesn't matter, okay? The body's a present inconvenience, which would make some people go, well, then what are we waiting for, okay? Which is part of the reason why, have you ever wondered why in the book of Matthew, when Matthew is describing what happens to Judas, it says that Judas went out and hanged himself? But when you read the book of Acts, which is written by Luke, it says that Judas fell off of a cliff and his organs burst out of his body cavity. Which is it? Did he hang himself or did he fall and he burst open? Yes. Okay. What's interesting is within the Jewish worldview, to hang from a tree, that was a sign of a curse. In the Greco-Roman world, if you killed yourself because of shame and remorse, that's a valiant thing to do. So if Luke's writing to a Greek culture, he doesn't want them to think like, well, Judas hanged himself like out of remorse, and that was a very virtuous thing to do. No, what most likely, the way that you think about this and the way that the gospel writers would have been sharing this was, if somebody hangs themselves and they're a Jewish individual, you don't mess with that body. Like it's going to stay there and rot. And they may come up and be like, yeah, there's Judas, okay? What happens over time to a body that's hanging, that's decomposing? Let's get gross. Let's get graphic. Well, yeah, and typically the weight. So either the rope broke or the neck broke, and he fell off of the cliff of wherever the tree was, and a body that's been decomposing in the sun, when it hits the ground, what does it do? Okay? So they're right on both occasions. Now, what are we talking about here? Oh, Platonic view. Matter is evil, okay? I mentioned this just to say from a Jewish perspective, the reason why that's written that way is because of how you would view somebody that would end their life. For somebody that would hold to a Platonic view, killing yourself for noble reason, that's great. You're escaping the evil, terrible material world. You're crossing over into a different existence. Here's some objections with this. Matter's not evil. God created all things good, including humanity. And that goes as far as even to say what you do with your body matters, even now. You can glorify God with your body, or you can defame him with your body. Another objection is that the resurrection is a spiritually physical event. I'll say that again. The resurrection is a spiritually physical event. Going to heaven when you die is not what we mean when we say the word resurrection, okay? Also, what we don't mean by resurrection is a revivification. There's your $9 word for the evening, a revivification of the body. What's a revivification? We talked about one already. Jairus' daughter. Was she resurrected or was she raised? She was raised. Was Lazarus, Jesus' friend, was he resurrected or was he raised? He was raised. They died. They were really dead. They entered into an intermediate state. When they were revived, they didn't enter into the resurrection. Very different. Jesus' resurrection, he's giving a glorified, spiritually physical body. What do I mean by that? Well, it's physical in that, like, he can say, hey, give me a piece of fish. I want to eat that. I'll show you it's really me. Mary clings to him. Stop clinging to me. I haven't ascended to my Father yet. Okay, these examples of something very physical. But he's also able to pop in and out of rooms when the doors are locked. He's very spiritually physical, okay? There's something different about the substance of his body. So when we start to talk about resurrection, this is going to be very important, because if you think about a Platonic view in the Greco-Roman world in Jesus' day, the body's just done away with. The spirit that goes on is what matters most, okay? In the Jewish worldview, well, you either go to Abraham's bosom or you go to Sheol, but there wasn't really this idea of resurrection until the very end of time, when God raises all of the faithful, all right? So there's the Platonic view, and then the last view of the conscious views is the embodied view. This is very similar to the perspective view that we talked about earlier, but it's a little bit different. It's like it in relation to time, but it's different in that the resurrection happens instantaneously, okay? It's not necessarily laid out that way biblically. We're going to talk about that later. There's no temporary mode of existence, so the final resurrection occurs for each person at the instance of his or her death, okay? Objections to that, we've got the passage in 2 Corinthians 5 that we looked at. The resurrection is understood as an end-time event for all simultaneously. Christ's resurrection points to the fact that this will happen and that it began with him. It's not an instantaneous thing. And then the last conscious view is the temporary disembodiment. This would be the traditional view of the intermediate state. This is the more biblical of the views. I don't have as much of a problem with the embodiment view. Like, if you want to talk about, like, oh, they've received a resurrected body. We can talk about that. There is an existence that's different living that's going on here. We'll talk about that as well. But the temporary disembodied means that my body gives out, my soul or my spirit continues on in a conscious state of existence where there's a judgment of sorts that has already taken place. I know where I am, and by knowing where I am, I know what's coming. And I'm waiting on that time to come. And when that time comes, there's going to be a resurrection for everybody. Even the unrighteous will be resurrected and given a resurrection body that's fit for eternity in a place you don't want to be, versus having a resurrected body that is fit for a place that is new heaven and new earth. And we're going to get to that coming together.